The Kingdom of Galicia and Lodomeria, also known as Galicia, became a crownland of the Habsburg Monarchy as a result of the First Partition of Poland in 1772, when it became a kingdom under Habsburg rule. From 1804 to 1918 it was a crownland of the Austrian Empire. After the reforms of 1867, it became an ethnic Pole-administered autonomous unit under the Austrian crown. The country was carved from the entire southwestern part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Among the many ceremonial titles of the princes of Hungary was ruler of Galicia and Lodomeria. The name Galicia is the Latinized form of medieval Galician principality. Lodomeria is also a Latinized form of important medieval city of Volodymyr that was founded in the 10th century by the Vladimir the Great. King of Galicia and Lodomeria was a medieval title the King of Hungary adopted during his conquest of the region back in the 12th century. This historical region in Eastern Europe is divided today between Poland and Ukraine. The nucleus of historic Galicia consists of the modern Lviv, Ternopil, and Ivano-Frankivsk regions of western Ukraine. Ceremonial name. The name of the kingdom in its ceremonial form, known in English as Kingdom of Galicia and Lodomeria and the Grand Duchy of Krakow with the Duchies of Auschwitz and Zeta, existed in all languages spoken there including German. Königreich Galician und Lodomerian mit dem Großherzogtum Krakau und den Herzogtümern Auschwitz und Zeta, Polish, Królestwo Gallicii Lodomeria wrazz Wielkim Kiestwem Krakowskim I Kiestwem Oswisimirizatoru, Ukrainian, transliterated, Korolewstwo Halikani I Lodomeria Velikim Nyacustwem Krakowskim I Nyacustwami Osvencima I Zatoru, and Hungarian, Galicia Eokutes Lodomeria Kirilizaga Krakow Nagwihercegwe Segevelia Kutes Auschwitz Eokutes Zatohercegwe Segel. History. In 1772, Galicia was the largest part of the area annexed by the Habsburg Monarchy in the First Partition of Poland. As such, the Austrian region of Poland and what was later to become Ukraine was known as the Kingdom of Galicia and Lodomeria to underline the Hungarian claims to the country. However, after the Third Partition of Poland, a large portion of the ethnically Polish lands to the west was also added to the province, which changed the geographical reference of the term Galicia. Lviv served as capital of Austrian Galicia, which was dominated by the Polish aristocracy, despite the fact that the population of the eastern half of the province was mostly Ukrainian or Ruthenian, as they were known at the time. In addition to the Polish aristocracy and gentry who inhabited almost all parts of Galicia and the Ruthenians in the east, there existed a large Jewish population, also more heavily concentrated in the eastern parts of the province. During the first decades of Austrian rule, Galicia was firmly governed from Vienna, and many significant reforms were carried out by a bureaucracy staffed largely by Germans and Germanized Czechs. The aristocracy was guaranteed its rights, but these rights were considerably circumscribed. The former serfs were no longer mere chattel, but became subjects of law and were granted certain personal freedoms, such as the right to marry without the lord's permission. Their labor obligations were defined and limited, and they could bypass the lords and appeal to the imperial courts for justice. The Eastern Rite Uniate Church, which primarily served the Ruthenians, was renamed the Greek Catholic Church to bring it onto a par with the Roman Catholic Church. It was given seminaries, and eventually, a metropolitan. Although unpopular with the aristocracy, among the common folk, Polish and Ukrainian, Ruthenian alike. These reforms created a reservoir of goodwill toward the emperor which lasted almost to the end of Austrian rule. At the same time, however, the Austrian Empire extracted from Galicia considerable wealth and conscripted large numbers of the peasant population into its armed services. In 1815, as a result of decisions of the Congress of Vienna, the Lublin area and surrounding regions were ceded by the Austrian Empire to Congress Poland, which was ruled by the Tsar, and the Ternopil region, including the historical region of southern Podolia, was returned to the Austrian Empire by Russia, which had held it since 1809. The large city of Krakow and surrounding territory, formerly also part of newer West Galicia, became the semi-autonomous Free City of Krakow under supervision of the three powers sharing rule over Poland. The 1820s and 1830s were a period of bureaucratic rule overseen from Vienna. Most administrative positions were filled by German speakers, including German-speaking Czechs, although some of their children were already becoming Polonized. After the failure of the November insurrection in Russian Poland in 1830–31, in which a few thousand Galician volunteers participated, many Polish refugees arrived in Galicia. The latter 1830s were rife with Polish conspiratorial organizations whose work culminated in the unsuccessful Galician insurrection of 1846, which was easily put down by the Austrians with the help of a Galician peasantry that remained loyal to the emperor. The insurrection occurred in the western, Polish-populated part of Galicia. Polish manorial gentry supported or were sympathetic to barely concealed plans for an uprising to establish an independent Polish state, but peasants on the manorial estates of western Galicia, reduced to misery by poor harvests, saw little advantage for themselves in a free Poland and seized the opportunity to rise against the institution of serfdom, killing many of the estate owners. With the collapse of the uprising for a free Poland, the city of Krakow lost its semi-autonomy and was integrated into the Austrian Empire under the title of her duchy, and for practical purposes, was made part of Galicia by the Austrian authorities. In the same period, a sense of national awakening began to develop among the Ruthenians in the eastern part of Galicia, a circle of activists, primarily Greek Catholics and Arians, affected by the Romantic movement in Europe and the example of fellow Slavs elsewhere, especially in eastern Ukraine under the Russians, began to turn their attention to the common folk and the language. In 1837, the so-called Ruthenian Triad led by Markian Shashkevich published an Imf of the Dniester, a collection of folk songs and other materials in the common Ruthenian tongue. Alarmed by such democratism, the Austrian authorities and the Greek Catholic Metropolitan banned the book. In 1848, revolutionary actions broke out in Vienna and other parts of the Austrian Empire. In Lemberg, a Polish National Council, and then later, a Ukrainian or Ruthenian Supreme Council were formed. Even before Vienna had acted, the remnants of serfdom were abolished by the governor, Franz Stadion, in an attempt to thwart the revolutionaries. Moreover, Polish demands for Galician autonomy were countered by Ruthenian demands for national equality and for a partition of the province into an eastern, Ruthenian part, and a western, Polish part. Eventually, Lemberg was bombarded by imperial troops and the revolution put down completely. A decade of renewed absolutism followed, but to placate the Poles, Count Eugene Golichowski, a conservative representative of the Eastern Galician aristocracy, the so-called Podolans, was appointed viceroy. He began to Polonize the local administration and managed to have Ruthenian ideas of partitioning the province attempts shelved. He was unsuccessful, however, in forcing the Greek Catholic Church to shift to the use of the Western Gregorian calendar, or among Ruthenians generally, to replace the Cyrillic alphabet with the Latin alphabet. Constitutional experiments in 1859. Following Austro-Hungarian military defeat in Italy, the empire entered a period of constitutional experiments. In 1860, the Vienna government, influenced by Janusz-Golichowski, issued its October Diploma, which envisioned a conservative federalization of the empire. But a negative reaction in the German-speaking lands led to changes in government and the issuing of the February Patent, which watered down this decentralization. Nevertheless, by 1861, Galicia was granted a legislative assembly, a Galicia Diet. Although at first pro-Habsburg Ukrainian and Polish peasant representation was considerable in this body, and the pressing social and Ukrainian questions were discussed, administrative pressures limited the effectiveness of both peasant and Ukrainian representatives, and the Diet of Galicia became dominated by the Polish aristocracy and gentry, who favored further autonomy. This same year, disturbances broke out in Russian Poland and to some extent spilled over into Galicia. The same ceased to sit. By 1863, open revolt broke out in Russian Poland, and from 1864 to 1865 the Austro-Hungarian government declared a state of siege in Galicia, temporarily suspending civil liberties. The year 1865 brought a return to federal ideas along the lines suggested by Janusz-Golichowski, and negotiations on autonomy between the Polish aristocracy and Vienna began once again. Meanwhile, the Ruthenians felt more and more abandoned by Vienna, and among the old Ruthenians grouped around the Greek Catholic Cathedral of St. George, there occurred a turn towards Russia. The more extreme supporters of this orientation came to be known as Russophiles. At the same time, influenced by the Ukrainian language poetry of the Eastern Ukrainian writer Taras Shevchenko, a Ukrainophile movement arose which published literature in the Ukrainian, Ruthenian vernacular and eventually established a network of reading halls. Supporters of this orientation came to be known as populists, and later simply as Ukrainians. Almost all Ruthenians, however, still hoped for national equality and for an administrative division of Galicia along ethnic lines. Galician autonomy in 1866, following the Battle of Sadowa and the Austrian defeat in the Austro-Prussian War, the Austro-Hungarian Empire began to experience increased internal problems. In an effort to shore up support for the monarchy, Emperor Franz Joseph began negotiations for a compromise with the Magyar nobility to ensure the support. Some members of the government, such as the Austro-Hungarian Prime Minister Count Belcredi, advised the emperor to make a more comprehensive constitutional deal with all of the nationalities that would have created a federal structure. Belcredi worried that an accommodation with the Magyar interests would alienate the other nationalities. However, Franz Joseph was unable to ignore the power of the Magyar nobility, and they would not accept anything less than dualism between themselves and the traditional Austrian elites. Finally, after the so-called Ausgleich of February 1867, the Austrian Empire was reformed into a Just Austria-Hungary. Although the Polish and Czech plans for their parts of the monarchy to be included in the federal structure failed, a slow yet steady process of liberalization of Austrian rule in Galicia started. Representatives of the Polish aristocracy and intelligentsia addressed the emperor asking for greater autonomy for Galicia. The demands were not accepted outright, but over the course of the next several years a number of significant concessions concessions were made toward the establishment of Galician autonomy. From 1873, Galicia was de facto an autonomous province of Austria-Hungary with Polish and, to a much lesser degree, Ukrainian or Ruthenian as official languages. The Germanization had been halted and the censorship lifted as well. Galicia was subject to the Austrian part of the dual monarchy, but the Galician Sejm and provincial administration had extensive privileges and prerogatives, especially in education, culture, and local affairs. These changes were supported by many Polish intellectuals. In 1869, a group of young conservative publicists in Kraków, including Józef Żuczki, Stanislaw Tarnowski, Stanislaw Kosmian and Ludwik Wodzicki, published a series of satirical pamphlets entitled Tika Stanchika, only 5 years after the tragic end of the January uprising. The pamphlets ridiculed the idea of armed national uprisings and suggested compromise with Poland's enemies, especially the Austrian Empire, concentration on economic growth, and acceptance of the political concessions offered by Vienna. This political grouping came to be known as the Stanchiks or Kraków Conservatives, together with the Eastern Galician conservative Polish landowners and aristocracy called the Podolans. They gained a political ascendancy in Galicia which lasted to 1914. This shift in power from Vienna to the Polish landowning class was not welcomed by the Ruthenians, who became more sharply divided into Russophiles, who looked to Russia for salvation, and Ukrainians who stressed their connections to the common people. Both Vienna and the Poles saw treason among the Russophiles, and a series of political trials eventually discredited them. Meanwhile, by 1890, an agreement was worked out between the Poles and the populist Ruthenians or Ukrainians, which saw the partial Ukrainianization of the school system in eastern Galicia and other concessions to Ukrainian culture. Thereafter, the Ukrainian national movement spread rapidly among the Ruthenian peasantry and, despite repeated setbacks, by the early years of the 20th century this movement had almost completely replaced other Ruthenian groups as the main rival for power with the Poles. Throughout this period, the Ukrainians never gave up the traditional Ruthenian demands for national equality and for partition of the province into a western Polish half and an eastern Ukrainian half. The great economic emigration beginning in the 1880s, a mass emigration of the Galician peasantry occurred. The emigration started as a seasonal one to Germany and then later became a transatlantic one with large-scale emigration to the United States, Brazil, and Canada, caused by the backward economic condition of Galicia where rural poverty was widespread. The emigration began in the western, Polish-populated part of Galicia and quickly shifted east to the Ukrainian-inhabited parts. Poles, Ukrainians, Jews, and Germans all participated in this mass movement of country folk and villages. Poles migrated principally to New England and the Midwestern states of the United States, but also to Brazil and elsewhere. Ruthenians, Ukrainians migrated to Brazil, Canada, and the United States, with a very intense emigration from southern Podolia to western Canada, and Jews emigrated both directly to the New World and also indirectly via other parts of Austria-Hungary. A total of several 100,000 people were involved in this great economic emigration, which grew steadily more intense until the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. The war put a temporary halt to the emigration, which never again reached the same proportions. The great economic emigration, especially the emigration to Brazil, the Brazilian fever as it was called at the time, was described in contemporary literary works by the Polish poet Maria Konopnicka, the Ukrainian writer Ivan Franko, and many others. Some states in south of Brazil have a large percentage of the population formed by direct descendants of these Ruthenians, Ukrainians immigrants. When it comes to the social relations, most especially between peasants and landlords, the area was the most backwards in the former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. For the entire 19th century, the majority of landlords viewed peasants as less than human. When the lot of the peasants under the Prussian partition was made better by laws and in the Russian partition by the majority of the Polish landlords de facto abolishing serfdom in exchange for the peasants sending the children to free of charge schools training them to be Poles, and nobility adopted all free peasants to prevent the Russian emperor from forcing them into serfdom. The Galician peasantry was always living at the verge of starvation. This led the Polish peasants to call the area Królestwo Galicji I Lodomeria, i.e., the kingdom of bareness and starvation. At the same time as these emigrations in the 1890s, many Polish and Ukrainian liberals saw Galicia as a Galician Piedmont, both a Polish Piedmont and a Ukrainian Piedmont, because Italians had started their liberation from Austrian rule in the Italian Piedmont. These Ukrainian and Polish nationalists felt that the liberation of the two countries would begin in Galicia. Despite nearly 750,000 persons emigrating across the Atlantic from 1880 to 1914, Galicia's population increased by 45% between 1869 and 1910. First World War and Polish-Ukrainian conflict. During the First World War, Galicia saw heavy fighting between the forces of Russia and the Central Powers. The Russian forces overran most of the region in 1914 after defeating the Austro-Hungarian army in a chaotic frontier battle in the opening months of the war. They were in turn pushed out in the spring and summer of 1915 by a combined German and Austro-Hungarian offensive. In 1918, Western Galicia became a part of the restored Republic of Poland, which absorbed the Lemko-Russian Republic. The local Ukrainian population briefly declared the independence of Eastern Galicia as the West Ukrainian People's Republic. During the Polish-Soviet War, the Soviets tried to establish the puppet state of the Galician SSR in East Galicia, the government of which after a couple of months was liquidated. The fate of Galicia was settled by the Peace of Riga on March 18, 1921, attributing Galicia to the Second Polish Republic. Although never accepted as legitimate by some Ukrainians, it was internationally recognized with significant French support on May 15, 1923. The French support for Polish rule of ethnically Ukrainian Eastern Galicia and its oil resources in the Borisław Beach Basin were rewarded by Warsaw, allowing significant French investment to pour into the Polish oil industry. The Poles had convinced the French that since less than 25% of the ethnic Ukrainians were literate before the Great War and Ukrainians were novices in governing themselves, only the Poles, not the Ukrainians, would be able to administer Eastern Galicia and its precious oil assets. The Ukrainians of the former Eastern Galicia and the neighboring province of Volhynia made up about 12% of the Second Polish Republic population, and were its largest minority. As Polish government policies were unfriendly towards minorities, tensions between the Polish government and the Ukrainian population grew, eventually giving the rise to the militant underground organization of Ukrainian nationalists. administrative divisions. Soon the newly acquired Polish territories, which were known as Kries, were restructured in November of 1773 into 59 Krii districts. While Krises were abolished, some former voivodeships were incorporated completely, while most of them only partially. Among them were the former voivodeships of Belz, Red Ruthenian, Krakow, Lublin, Sandomierz, and Podoli. Also during the Russo-Turkish War in 1769, the northwestern territory of Moldavia was occupied by the Russian Empire, which ceded it in 1774 to the Austrian Empire as a token of appreciation. Major cities and towns administrative division. The kingdom was split into numerous counties, which in 1914 were about 75. Besides Lwow being the capital of the kingdom, Krakow was considered as the unofficial capital of the western part of Galicia and the second most important city in the region. Government. After the partition of Poland, the region was governed by an appointed governor, later a vice-regent. During the wartime, the office of vice-regent was supplemented by a military governor. In 1861, a regional assembly was established, the same of the land, which initially, due to lack of adequate administrative building, was located in the building of the Skarbek Theatre until 1890. Vice-regents. List of vice-regents since 1900. Count Leon Pilinski, Count Andrzej Potocki, Count Michel Bobrinsky, Witold Korytowski. Russian occupation. Hermann von Collard, Baron Erich von Diller, exiled due to Russian occupation. Russian occupation. Count Karl Georg Wien, in fact subordinate to the Regency Council and its General Commissar Prince Witold Leon Czartoryski instead of the Austrian crown. Political parties and public organizations. Political chief. Ruthenian Council, headed by Gregory Yakimovich and later by Mikhailo Kuzemski. It consisted of 30 members. Ruthenian Council. Ruthenian Congress was an oppositional political formation to the chief Ruthenian Council, to which belong such personalities as Ivan Vahilovich, Julian Lorevsky, Leon Sapieta, and others. Ukrainian National Democratic Party was created in place of the People's Council, eventually becoming part of the Ukrainian National Democratic Alliance. Ukrainian Radical Party. Christian Social Party, until 1911 was called as Catholic Ruthenian People's Union. In 1930 it split when some members joined UNDU, while others created Ukrainian Catholic People's Party. Ukrainian Social Democratic Party was created by some members of the Ukrainian Radical Party and in 1924 partially merged with Communist Party of Western Ukraine. Ukrainian General Council, initially as the chief Ukrainian Council, was a national political bloc of most of the Ukrainian parties. It laid foundation for creating the Ukrainian state in the West Ukraine. Public Ukrainian Forum, a forum-type association created by Julian Lorevsky based on the Lviv intelligentsia circle, Young Rus. The organization established its own Ukrainian-based professional theater, Prosvita, Shevchenko Scientific Society. Ruthenian Triad literary organization discontinued after the death of Markian Shashkevich. Academic Society, until 1896 as Brotherhood, Academical Circle, Sokol and Sokol Sport organization created in light of the European Sokol movement. Sikonplast, Lu, a Firemen's Society, Riflemen's Association. Demographics. In 1773, Galicia had about 2.6 million inhabitants in 280 cities and markets and approx. 5,500 villages. There were nearly 19,000 noble families with 95,000 members. The non-free accounted for 1.86 million, more than 70% of the population. A small number were full farmers, but by far the overwhelming number had only small holdings and no possessions. No country of the Austrian monarchy had such a varied ethnic mix as Galicia. Poles, Ruthenians, Germans, Armenians, Jews, Hungarians, Romani people, Lithuania, etc. The Poles were mainly in the west, with the Ruthenians predominant in the eastern region. The Jews of Galicia had immigrated in the Middle Ages from Germany and mostly spoke Yiddish as the first language. German-speaking people were more commonly referred to by the region of Germany where they originated, with inhabitants who had a clear difference in language, such as with the Saxons of the Roma. Identification was less problematic, but widespread multilingualness blurred the borders again. It is, however, possible to make a clear distinction in religious denominations. The majority of the Poles were Latin Catholics, while the Ruthenians were mostly Greek Catholics. The Jews, who represented the third largest religious group, were mostly Orthodox in the religious observance. The average life expectancy was 27 years for men and 28.5 years for women, as compared to 33 and 37 in Bohemia, 39 and 41 in France, and 40 and 42 in England. Also, the quality of life was much lower. The yearly consumption of meat did not exceed 10 kilograms per capita, as compared to 24 kilograms in Hungary and 33 in Germany. This was mostly due to much lower average income. In 1888, Galicia had 78,550 square kilometers of area and was populated by California, 6.4 million people, including 4.8 million peasants. The population density was 81 people per square kilometer and was higher than in France or Germany.